And now, Give Maggie a Chance. Written by Frieda Wishinsky. Illustrated by Dean Griffiths. Maggie leapt out of bed. She slipped on her new dress and spun like a ballerina in her new shoes. She skipped all the way to her new class. At school, Maggie sat in the second row beside Sam. Kimberly sat in front of them. The teacher, Mrs. Brown, said, "Who would like to come up and read?" Maggie's hand shot up. She was good at reading. Maggie walked to the front of the class. Her heart thumped like a drum. Her knees quivered like jelly. Her mouth felt as dry as a desert. Maggie opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Not a word, not a sound, not even a whisper. "Let me read," shouted Kimberly, leaping out of her seat. "Sit down, Kimberly," said Mrs. Brown. "Give Maggie a chance." But Maggie didn't want a chance. Maggie wanted the floor to swallow her up. Maggie wanted a rocket to blast her to Mars. Maggie wanted a genie to make the class disappear. But the class did not disappear, and Kimberly read. The day dragged on. Like a nightmare, it wouldn't end. Finally, the home bell rang. Kimberly tapped Maggie on the shoulder. "Reading is so easy," said Kimberly. "I've been reading since I was a baby." Maggie's face turned as red as a radish. "Don't," said Sam. "Don't let Kimberly bother you." "I'll try," said Maggie, but it was hard. Maggie trudged home. "How was school today?" asked her mother. "Terrible," said Maggie. "Maybe tomorrow will be better," said her mother. "Maybe tomorrow will be worse," said Maggie. At home, Maggie slumped on her bed. She felt like crying. Then she remembered Sam's words. Sam was right. She shouldn't let Kimberly bother her. Maggie stood up. She lined her stuffed animals on her bed. She read them a story loudly, clearly, perfectly. Just like a teacher. "Tomorrow I will read like that to my class," she told herself. The next day, Mrs. Brown said, "Who'll read the first line in our new book?" Maggie's hand shot up. "Maggie?" said Mrs. Brown. Maggie opened her mouth to read, but nothing came out. The teacher waited. The class waited. Everyone waited except Kimberly. My turn, called Kimberly, jumping up and down like a yo-yo. "Maggie, you'll read another time," said Mrs. Brown gently. "Go ahead, Kimberly." Maggie wished a giant wave would wash Kimberly out the door. She wished a giant bird would fly Kimberly out the window. She wished a giant troll would dump Kimberly into a dungeon. But a wave didn't come. A bird didn't fly. A troll didn't show. Kimberly read. The day dragged on. Like a toothache, it wouldn't end. Finally, the home bell rang. Kimberly tapped Maggie on the shoulder. "The last book I read had 100 pages and 1,000,000 hard words," she said. Maggie's eyes flooded with tears. "Don't worry," stuttered Sam. "You'll read tomorrow?" Maggie brushed her tears away. "I hope so," she said. All the way home, Maggie remembered Sam's words. "I'll read tomorrow," she promised herself. "I won't let anything stop me." The next day, Mrs. Brown asked, "Who'd like to read problem number 3 in our math book?" Maggie took a deep breath. Today was the day. Today she'd read. All she had to do was raise her hand. But Maggie couldn't move her hand. Her hands felt glued to her sides. Maggie's heart sunk as Kimberly flapped her hands in the air like a seagull. "Me! Me!" shouted Kimberly. Mrs. Brown called on Sam. "It's..." stuttered Sam. Mrs. Brown waited. Sam tried again. "What's the matter with you?" snickered Kimberly. "Can't you talk?" Sam sunk down in his chair. Maggie couldn't stand it. She glared at Kimberly. "Give Sam a chance," said Maggie. "Sam knows the answer." "But he can't say it," sneered Kimberly. "Oh, yes he can," said Maggie. 6, said Sam, popping out of his seat. "Right, Sam," said Mrs. Brown. "Now, who'd like to come up and explain the problem to the class?" Maggie's hand shot up. "Come on up, Maggie," said Mrs. Brown. Maggie walked to the front of the class. And as she did, Kimberly made a rude noise and stuck out her tongue. But Maggie didn't care what Kimberly did. Maggie didn't care what Kimberly thought. It was as if a magician had whisked Kimberly away. It was as if a witch had poofed her to smoke. It was as if a wizard had turned her into a small, warty toad. Maggie only saw her friend Sam. Sam was smiling at her. Sam knew Maggie could do it. Sam knew Maggie didn't need any more chances. Sam knew that today Maggie would read in front of the class. So she did.